All right, so for those of you just joining us on the video, welcome to our last seminar session. We've been talking through the announcements. I don't need to optimize for video. There we go. So remember to get your Unit 4 and 5 reading guides done. Get the Unit 4 and 5 test done. Last call on that is Tuesday. The reading guides last call is Friday. Final exam, sign up for a time, please. Make sure to look at that instruction sheet. There's the review sheet already in the course. We will not have seminar sessions next week because it is finals week, so this is it. And then make sure that this week you finish strong and get the seminar work done. Week 18 CNN 10 News Quiz and the Week 18 Seminar Journal. Any question on any of that? All right, and I'll be available after our session today if you have something you need to talk about that's just pertaining to you. All right, so this is a big topic that we need to get through today, unfortunately. This is something we usually take like 2 class periods to get through, but we got to get through it today because this really sets up the rest of the 20th century. So basically everything we're talking about next semester is set up by this, the peace that follows World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. So much of even our modern world today has its roots back here at the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, conflicts from the Middle East to the Balkan War all have their roots back here. It's hugely important. Okay, so one of the people that was the architect of this post-war peace was this guy. That is Woodrow Wilson. He was president of the United States. Remember that he actually got reelected in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and then he promptly brought us into what would become World War I. And as America was entering this war, Wilson already had a notion of what he wanted to see in a post-war peace. And he laid this out in a speech that becomes known as the 14 points. This was the 14-point speech, Wilson's 14 points, which was sort of his plan for the post-war peace. This included things like free trade. Wilson was one of the first people that was really talking about the notion of taking down trade barriers, which is kind of like what NAFTA and the WTO and those sorts of things do today. So Wilson was one of the first people that was really talking about this. The idea being countries that trade with each other aren't going to fight each other. That's one of the reasons why the idea of a war with China nowadays is not all that likely, because we trade with China. China trades with us. We're important trading nations with the other. And the idea of us harming that trade relationship, it's hard to see. Open agreements, no more secret alliances. That was one of the things that helped cause this war, was there were these alliances, and some of them nobody knew about except the 2 countries involved. So Wilson wanted to end those things. Democracy and self-determination, letting people, oh, and by the way, letting white people. Wilson was not so much for democracy and self-determination for example, the nations of Africa or the nations of Asia. Really not so much for that. But letting white people and white nationalities determine what their future was going to be. Incidentally, Wilson was one of the more racist people we've ever had as president of the United States. Just throwing that out there. Kind of the big thing, and this is the one that Wilson's going to go to the mat over, is the League of Nations. This idea of having a community of power in a place where countries can come to resolve disputes. Wilson's going to end up throwing out the rest of this like the minute he gets to Paris. He's like, oh, none of the rest of you want these other things? Fine, whatever. But we keep the League of Nations. It's basically the one thing that he really gets in the Treaty of Versailles. And then the U.S. doesn't join it. Yeah, we don't even ratify the treaty. It's glorious. Oh, and one of the big things and this really is counter to what the European nations wanted. Wilson said that the U.S. was not interested in money or territory as a result of this war. The nations of Europe were very interested in money and territory as a result of this war. So already Wilson's sort of flying in the face of everything the European nations are trying to do. So one of the big things that's going to happen here is that Wilson is going to himself personally go to Paris to negotiate this treaty. That's huge. Wilson is the first American president to, during his term of office, leave the country. And that meant, I mean, about a week's voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to get to Paris. That's a big deal. So Wilson is going to be the leader of the U.S. delegation at this conference, but he almost immediately steps in it. And that is that he forgets, maybe, that his opposition party controls the U.S. Senate. This was before, now we haven't really had treaties in the United States for a while. Our most recent presidents have all signed what are known as executive agreements that can have the force of treaties while they're president, but then the next guy can ignore them. But they also don't have to be passed by the Senate. Wilson, at this point, there was no executive agreements. So Wilson had to get this thing passed by the U.S. Senate. And that's not going to happen. And largely because Wilson's not going to invite any of the Republicans to come with him to negotiate this treaty. That was probably a mistake on his part. Wilson's also going to change international diplomacy by insisting that the negotiations for this treaty be conducted in English. Up to this point, international negotiations, whether it was between France and another country, or Japan and Russia, or whoever, they were conducted in French. That was the language of international diplomacy. Wilson's going to change that. The language of international diplomacy is now English. And it's because of Woodrow Wilson going to this conference, and he didn't speak French. He just didn't. And so he said, I want to participate, and so I demand, as, leader of the United States, talk about your white privilege, he demands that, everybody speak English. So that's going to change diplomacy forever. So this picture shows what are known as the big three of this conference. So you have Wilson there on the far right. In the middle, you have a guy by the name of Georges Clemenceau, who looks more like a walrus than any human being has a right to. And then the guy on the far left is David Lloyd George. So Clemenceau was the French prime minister. Lloyd George was the British prime minister. By the way, Lloyd George actually tried to take over the British government during World War II, tried to oust Churchill and take over during World War II. He was still alive at that point. Really fascinating story if you ever get the opportunity. So yeah, that huge deal. Wilson actually goes to Paris, and the people greet Wilson because he has published and espoused these great ideals about democracy and self-determination, and the people are like, oh, viva Wilson, yay, he's here. And then he's going to immediately basically abandon everything. By the way, it was supposed to be a big four. Italy was supposed to be one of the big-time players in this conference, but once Wilson shows up, the Italians basically get ignored. By the way, in that one picture, it looks like he's walking with Joseph Stalin. That's not Joseph Stalin. Okay, so this is just a painting of the signing and negotiation of this document, which takes place at the palace at Versailles, which was the home of the French kings when there were French kings. The place where it was signed was known as the Hall of Mirrors. You can actually, if we ever get out of this COVID mess and you ever get to travel to France, you can go to the palace at Versailles. It's very beautiful. It's one of apparently the most beautiful places in the world. It is someplace I would like to visit if I ever get to travel anywhere ever again. All right, so what we're going to skip ahead to now is sort of how some of the countries that are going to be important down the line get impacted by the Treaty of Versailles. And the first one is Japan. Japan was there. Japan was a really important part of World War One. Not only Germany had colonial possessions in the Pacific, and Japan joined the Allies fairly early on. They took over some of those German colonial possessions on behalf of the Allies, and they even sent a few ships, not a ton, but a few ships, to the Mediterranean to help out Allied war effort in the Mediterranean. That's a really big deal. I mean, Japan had, aside from the British, the Americans, and the Germans, the Japanese Navy was one of the best in the world at this point. Remember, they had just won a war against Russia, which is, a big deal. So Japan had a seat at the table, and when it came time to debate what the League of Nations was going to look like, Japan put forth the following proposal. The equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations. The high contracting parties, which is what the name for the Allies was, agree to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction, either in law or in fact, on account of their race or nationality. This was a racial equality provision that the Japanese wanted to put in the League of Nations Charter, basically saying if you're a member of the League, it is not okay for you to discriminate against people based on their national origin or their race. What countries do you think might be opposed to something like this? Go ahead and unmute yourself and tell me.
Most European countries.
So actually, a lot of the European countries were okay with this, even the French, which actually surprised me a bit because the French had a lot of colonial possessions that they didn't want to treat as equals. But the big one that was not okay with this was the British, and in particular, a couple of their colonial possessions that had seats at the table. Australia and South Africa were huge against this. Remember, South Africa at this point was under what was known as the apartheid regime, where a very small minority of white, basically British people, ran this country that was overwhelmingly black. Okay, by the way, that's going to last into the 1990s. Okay, and Australia, if you think how the United States treated our native population is bad, sometime read up on what the Australians did to the native population of Australia. It's as bad or worse than what we did to Native Americans. Okay, so Australia and South Africa in particular were against this. The British did not want to treat because this would have made them treat their colonial possessions the same that they treated Englishmen. And that was really not okay with the British. How about the Americans? Do you think the Americans were okay with this?
I don't think they were, or
No.
if they really cared that much about it.
No, I mean, think about it. So not only were we mistreating Native Americans at this point, but this was the era of the Jim Crow laws in the South. This would have meant that the League of Nations would have been able to basically, if nothing else, scold the United States about how the United States treated racial minorities in this country. So the thing was that most of the countries that attended this conference thought this was a great idea, except for a handful, including the United States, Britain, Australia, South Africa. The leader of the committee that was making this decision was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson used his power as chair to declare that any vote that would go to pass this, in order for this to pass, had to be unanimous. And thus, even though it passed overwhelmingly, had this been a simple majority vote, would have been overwhelming, Wilson ruled that the motion failed because he said that to pass it, it needed to be unanimous. So this was never put into the League of Nations Charter. And so Japan was also ended up this conference. They thought they were going to get to keep those German territorial possessions, those colonies, and they didn't. They got part of China, which, by the way, China was also one of the victorious countries. And China's like, excuse us? Why does Japan get part of our country? But Japan doesn't get nearly the territory that they were promised when they agreed to join the Allies. And so Japan leaves this conference basically going, if we're going to advance, if we're going to grow our empire, and Japan needed to grow its empire because they didn't have a lot of natural resources. So they basically leave and go, if we're going to advance and grow and become self-sufficient, we can't rely on these European countries to help us. We need to, basically go and conquer. And so it's at that point that Japan is going to make sort of a hard right turn. That's right. And they're going to embrace militarism. And pretty soon they're going to start taking over areas like Korea. And that sort of hits its apex on December 7th, 1941. So this really sets up Japan to be one of the troublemaking countries for World War II in a big way. What about Italy? So at the start of this war, Italy was supposed to be part of the Central Powers. Italy already had an established alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But they held back in joining the Central Powers. And so the Allies started working on them. And actually, the Italians kind of were shuttling back and forth between the two alliances, trying to get the best deal. And ultimately, they get the best deal from the Allies. And the Allies promised them essentially the moon. I mean, really, they promised them a ton of territory and influence when this is all said and done. And Italy does its part. Italy loses 600,000 men in battle in World War I. And they were promised significant portions of Austria-Hungary as a result of this. And then a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, the Americans are going to join the war. Number two, the Russians are going to exit the war, and the Bolsheviks, the party that takes over Russia, they're going to release all of the secret, alliances and agreements that the Allies had in place. And that's going to make Britain and France and the Allies look really bad, because the agreement with Italy was a secret. It was signed, it was called the Treaty of London, and it was signed in London early on in the war, and it promised Italy all this territory. And so the British and the French are going to kind of have to backtrack off of that. So the Italians are not going to get nearly what they'd been promised. And you can kind of see that from this map. They get a little bit of territory here so that's the old empire. Here's the new empire there on the right. You can see they get a little bit of what had been, Austria-Hungary there, and a little bit of area on the coast. But they were promised a lot more, and they don't get that. And they're largely ignored at the Paris conference. It was supposed to be a big four. Well, it was originally supposed to be big three: Italy, France, Britain. It becomes a big four when at the addition of the United States, and the United States basically muscles out Italy, so that it's ultimately a big three. And the Italian prime minister actually goes home. He leaves his foreign minister to sign the Treaty of Versailles, because he's basically like, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going home. And so ultimately, Italy leaves the conference kind of like the Japanese, going, if we want to expand our empire, we're going to have to just start taking stuff over. And we can't cooperate with these other countries. And so a couple years after this, a guy named Benito Mussolini is going to start saying, we can be a great Empire again, we can recreate Rome, but we have to be strong in order to make Italy great again, basically. And that starts Italy's path. I mean, Benito Mussolini is the grandpappy of European fascism. I mean, there would have been no Hitler without Benito Mussolini. So that's a big deal. Before we get to the big one, though, the Middle East. Our current problems in the Middle East can be traced back to the peace from the Treaty of Versailles. So the British and the French had been encouraging the Arab minority in this area to rise up against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the other part of this of this war. Okay, so they start this with a thing called the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, not Hussein like Saddam Hussein. But the British agreed to, and this family, the Sharif of Mecca, who was known as Hussein bin Ali, agrees to lead an uprising amongst the Arab population. The Ottoman Empire was basically controlled by Turks, what would today be Turkey. So Hussein bin Ali agrees to lead this uprising, and in exchange, he's supposed to get basically an Arab country to lead. All right, so that's this Hussein-McMahon correspondence. At the same time, the British and the French are working together, and they have what's known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they agree to, at the end of the war, they're going to carve up these areas amongst themselves and basically have influence over these areas. So they're already double-crossing Hussein bin Ali. And then at the same time, the British signed something called the Balfour Declaration that says that Jewish people are going to be allowed to immigrate to an area called Palestine in order to set up a homeland, because nobody in Europe wanted the Jews. Okay, so they're crossing and double crossing all sorts of people. So at the end of all of this, what's going to end up happening is the British and the French are going to divide up this area, and they're going to make no real allowances for the people that actually live there. So a great example is Iraq. Iraq lumps together 3 distinct groups that all hate each other. You have in the northern part of Iraq a group called the Kurds. The Kurds are also in part of Syria and in southern Turkey. They would like to be a country in and of themselves, but because they're divided between 3 countries, they can't ever get enough people to get an independent country going, to secede from their other countries. Okay, you also have Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, all in the same country. Iraq is originally led by Hussein's son, who is eventually overthrown, and that leads to, about a generation later, a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein coming to power, who rules Iraq, and he keeps Iraq together largely by force. He's a dictator. Syria also gets overthrown by actually the same party that Saddam Hussein represented, ruled Syria, and that party's still in power in Syria. Jordan, Hussein's other son, is put in charge of Jordan. That family still runs Jordan. Okay, but they just drew lines. Ooh, how about this? And that Palestine area eventually gets annexed, and half of it becomes Israel, and then pretty soon all of it becomes Israel. So we still have problems with all of these areas today. There's still a massive genocide and civil war going on in Syria. There's still problems in Iraq. Jordan's relatively peaceful, but then Israel is still an issue in the Middle East. So, yeah, all of those things come back to the Treaty of Versailles, and the British and the French basically crossing and double crossing and triple crossing each other and everybody else. And if you wonder why the residents of that area don't necessarily trust Western influence, that would be why, right there. Russia. Remember, Russia was on the winning side, but they exited the war early. And they also release everybody's little secrets. So aside from China, they are the only allied country that loses territory as a result of this war. And their territory is largely going to go to Poland, but also several other countries. We'll look at a map here in a minute. Oh, and also the US, Britain, and France are going to send special forces to aid the enemies of the Bolsheviks, the White Army, in the Russian Civil War. So if you wonder why the Soviets weren't so fond of America and Britain and France, that would be why right there. So we'll see that here in a minute. And then, of course, Germany. Germany is forced to accept 100% responsibility for the war, even though they didn't actually start the war. Isn't the Lawrence of Arabia based on that part of the war? Yes, Lawrence of Arabia, based on very loosely based on a true story, really loosely based on a true story. It's a fun movie, but don't take it as historical gospel.
So
Yeah.
I still fail to understand why the Bolsheviks didn't like the Americans.
So
Were we?
America, Britain, and France sent special forces, so basically sent military forces to aid the enemies of the Bolsheviks.
Oh, I
Yeah.
did not know that.
Yeah, that's a very underreported part of history, but it wasn't a ton, but they were trying to get basically the old government reinstated, the democratic government, the non-communist government. Yeah. So, yeah, there we go. And I apologize that we're having to zip through all of this. Like I said, usually we'd take like 2 class periods to discuss this whole thing. Germany had to take sole guilt for the war. They were forced to pay reparations of, at the time, $55 billion. So we're talking like close to 300 billion today, which there was no way the Germans were ever going to be able to pay that off. They actually just finished paying it off a few years ago. Germany lost all of its colonial possessions. They lost Alsace-Lorraine. They lost a big chunk of territory in the east. In fact, there's this little part of Germany on this map here. You see this little area. There's main Germany, and then off to the side, there's another area marked Germany. That's a little area called East Prussia. And the rest of that area was taken away from Germany to give Poland a route to the sea. And then when we get to World War II, the Nazis are going to take over Western Poland and the Soviets are going to take over Eastern Poland and just divide it up. But then taken from the Soviets or the Russians, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland. So you can see that the Soviets lost a huge amount of territory as well. Austria-Hungary ceases to exist. Czechoslovakia is created out of that. Austria, Hungary, Romania gets part of Austria-Hungary. Yugoslavia is created out of that. So all sorts of new countries are created out of those old empires. But Germany, Alsace-Lorraine is that area in the west over here next to France. I apologize for the quality of the map, but that little area of what was Germany that's now a red border around it, that's Alsace-Lorraine. And that's going to be when Germany starts aggressing, it's going to be one of the first things they do is they're going to take over Alsace-Lorraine. And the French are going to go, well, we don't want a war, so yeah, go ahead, fine, take it. So the big thing was the reparations. And the Germans, by the way, they were there, but they didn't get to speak at the peace conference. So they couldn't object. They just had to take it. And that's why a few years down the road, when a guy like Hitler comes to power and says, we didn't really lose World War I, the German people go, well, yeah, that's true. You know, we were never occupied. And when he says we shouldn't have to obey the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans go, yeah, why should we obey the Treaty of Versailles? So yeah, ultimately this leads to World War II. And this is just another map that shows sort of the countries created out of Europe. And of course, the United States, just very briefly, the US does not ever, so they sign there, but they never ratify this treaty. And the big objection was the League of Nations, the thing that Wilson threw out all the rest of the 14 points. Basically said, fine, whatever, I'll accept whatever, but we have to have a League of Nations. The U.S. Senate was like, we don't want to join a League of Nations. One of the provisions of the League was an attack on one League nation is an attack on all of them. And the Senate was like, we don't want to get bogged down if, Romania gets drunk and attacks Bulgaria. We don't want to send troops. We don't want to be forced to send troops. So, no, we're not going to pass this. And they don't. The U.S. eventually signs a document that says we're no longer at war. But we never join the League, which is going to doom the League to failure. The League will die about the time World War II breaks out. The League just basically disintegrates, and their records and whatnot all fold into the United Nations at the end of World War II. But without the United States, Russia never joins the League. Germany is a member of the League for a while, but they get out once the League starts to question what Hitler's doing. Italy's a member of the League, but they get out once the League starts questioning what Mussolini was doing in Africa. Without those countries, the League ceases to exist. Wilson, in an effort to pass this treaty, goes out on a cross-country tour by train, trying to convince people to contact their senators and get them to support the treaty. While that is happening, Wilson has a stroke, and he is incapacitated for the final 18 months of his term. His wife, his second wife, his first wife died during his first term. He met this woman, Edith Galt. He courted her, got engaged, got married to her, and she ultimately runs the country for the remaining 18 months of Wilson's term. She says, oh, I'll take this in for the president to sign, and she goes in, closes the door, comes out, the piece of paper is signed, never mind, the signature's totally different. Wilson is basically an invalid for the rest of his term. The U.S. does become, for a period of time, a nation that other countries owe money to, because we had loaned a bunch of money to the Allies, even though we do not accept any part of the German reparations. But other countries owed us $11.5 billion, one of the only times that the United States was actually owed money. That ain't gonna last. But America turns away from the rest of the world and becomes highly isolationist until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, there you go. So, in your journal topic this week, your journal topic for the week, briefly describe some of the impacts of the Treaty of Versailles and how the treaty had major implications on the remainder of the 20th century. So, give me a couple good specifics. All right. Any questions on anything that we discussed today? Anyone know if the test is multiple choice or typing questions? It is a multiple choice test, and that information is actually in the instruction sheet that I posted in the course. All right, if there are no questions, or if you need to talk about something individually, we can do that. I am going to let you go. So if you have no questions, goodbye. If you have questions, hang out and we'll talk about it. I'm going to turn off the recording.